Now on to our second topic. What does the term far-right mean? With the progress of Marine Le Pen to France's presidential runoff, the term has been liberally used, as it has been over recent years across the West. But has the term lost all meaning? I'm now joined by Douglas Murray, the author of The Strange Death of Europe, and David Goodhart, Head of Demography at Policy Exchange and the author of The Road to Somewhere. So I suppose let's start with a definition of the far-right. Douglas, what do you mean by the term far-right?
Well, I mean, and I think everyone used to mean a fascist, a Nazi, neo-Nazi, somebody who, for instance, didn't really believe in the democratic process, didn't mind the use of political violence or violence to achieve political ends, and a whole set of really nasty, ugly opinions behind that. Racism, all sorts of extremism. And I think most of us sort of knew what it meant. It was somewhere in that territory. Now, I think it is used very largely, as I said in this piece, by people for partisan political ends to smear and defame many people who I think should not be given the term. And the problem is, I think, that it is polluting our political discussion, and it's particularly polluting it across Europe, where it's not just that politics is on the march and the move, but the publics are clearly on the move. And that in such a situation, it's very dangerous simply to call everything you don't like far-right, because if you do call everything you don't like far-right, you end up, strangely, allowing the far-right in.
David, what do you see the term far-right meaning?
I agree with most of that, and I've heard far too many people just in the last few days describing the Front National, for example, as far-right, as fascist, actually. We had Dominic Moisy doing it at the Spectator event. I heard Bernard-Henri Lévy doing it at a Henry Jackson Society event. I heard on Newsnight last night Yanis Varoufakis calling the Front National fascist. And as Douglas says, this is far too easy. It means that a whole section of the left and the centre-left, liberal Europe, stops addressing the issues that these parties are winning a lot of support on. We simply do not acknowledge the extent to which some of these parties have changed their spots. And we're very asymmetrical on this. We're very happy to, how many was it? 4 or 5 people who sat in Tony Blair's first cabinet were former Trotskyists. We're happy to allow people to come in from the extremist cold on the left. We've historically tended to be much more reluctant to do it to people on the far right. They're moving, but it's only an apparent move. They retain their deeply embedded commitment to racism or anti-Semitism or whatever it is. Some people will be doing that. They will be disguising it. But I think we have to acknowledge that other people genuinely change.
Douglas, why do you think the term far left is less toxic than the term far right?
Gosh, it's an interesting question. A historical anomaly, apart from anything else. But if you want to regard how strong that anomaly remains, I mean, you consider that on May Day this year, the Shadow Chancellor, John MacDonnell, gives a speech in Trafalgar Square in front of banners with Stalin on them. I mean, the idea that Philip Hammond would ever speak at a rally in Trafalgar Square in front of banners of Goering or Goebbels, I mean, it's unimaginable. I think it might come down slightly to the thing that Robert Conquest spotted years ago. He said that there seemed to be something just worse about Nazism than about Soviet communism. It may have something to do with that. It may just be that the left has been more tolerant of people going on the move politically. My own suspicion is simply that for a whole variety of reasons in recent years, it's become one of the few things in politics which is fixed. Our politics is in real flux and has been for a very long time. And one of the few things we could all agree on in the political mainstream was that we didn't like the far right. And that gave us something to orient ourselves around. I say in the piece, like Cavafy's famous poem about the barbarians, waiting for the barbarians, when they don't come, they gave us a purpose of a kind. They gave us a meaning. And I think to some extent you could say that was the case with the far right. But I can't really answer the question. It's such a, as I say from that McDonnell example, such a crazy oddity.
I mean, and you rightly talk in the piece about how, to be more specific on the Front National, just how much they have changed in a whole set of policy areas and sort of philosophy too. They now, the Front National, like so many of these parties, do emerge from pretty murky waters. There's no question about that. Nobody's denying that for a moment. But they have emerged. They are now a party that supports laïcité. The whole anti-Semitic Catholic tradition anti-Dreyfus tradition was not to embrace laïcité. They now embrace laïcité. They talk about culture rather than race. They talk about being opposed to Islamism rather than Muslims. I mean, they've modified not only their policies but their whole philosophy. And you've had a lot of people coming into the party from the more mainstream right parties, and that has had a modifying and civilising influence on them. And if we are not to respect and welcome that, and indeed, if for our own political purposes we need to go on calling them fascists and far right, that is very unfortunate.
Do you think the fact that Marine Le Pen has now stood as an independent and separated herself from the Front National suggests that she recognises there's a kind of toxicity to it?
If she does recognise that, it can't have been a recent recognition. I mean, she's lived with it all her life. No, I think she's just trying to reflect Macron's significant advantage of being able to say in an anti-political age that I am not a party, there is not a mainstream sort of thing pulling me back, as it were. I don't think there's much more to the Le Pen's move than that. But just kind of at that point, I mean, if somebody politically, ends the career of their father for something, is it of no significance or is it of some significance? I think it's of some significance, whilst remaining very sceptical, as I think everybody should be, of a move by a party like the Front National, saying, we won't be satisfied with simply token gestures or anything like that. But it must matter a bit. I mentioned in the piece another example, the difference between, for instance, a party that is openly racist. I'm thinking of Jobbik in Hungary or the Golden Dawn in Greece, and a party which is not racist but may, for instance, be discovered to have racist members, or the difference between a party that has racist members and loves it and a party which, when it discovers it has racist members, kicks them out. Now, these seem to me to be very, very crucial divides. And yet all of the people that are lumped in as far right would encompass all of those things.
So an anti-immigration party, by definition, is not far right?
No, I give the example in the piece of the Sweden Democrats, who I think are almost always described as far right, and from simply speaking to people in the party for the course of the book I've been writing and seeing their events, I came to the conclusion that they should be regarded as being within the political mainstream. They are anti-mass immigration, but I did not think that they were a far-right fascist party.
No, I mean, so the Conservative Party is anti-mass immigration. I mean, it's a perfectly legitimate position to hold, and of course this is part of the problem. I mean, the word populism, for all of its sort of looseness and slackness, is in some ways a more useful one here. There are populist parties and there are far-right parties. I think the Front National, UKIP and so on should be described as populist parties. And the thing about populism, as many people who study it point out, is that populism is utterly mainstream in our political culture. I mean, wariness towards elites. I mean, it's built into the US Constitution, the separation. Why do we have the separation of powers? Because we're suspicious of people accumulating too much power. The idea that you should put the interests of your own citizens before the interests of citizens from other countries. Absolutely kind of mainstream idea. That populists take these ideas that are mainstream, but they take them more seriously than liberals do. I think the other problem here is definitions of racism. I mean, you might say that a lot of politics now is about how you define racism and even nationalism. Now, we can all agree that, or rather I would say conservatives and centrists agree that racism is about hostility towards, contempt towards outsider groups of various kinds, religious or ethnic. Now, liberals and people on the left will also obviously accept that definition, but they want a wider definition that includes too strong an attachment to your own group, or your own nation indeed. And obviously it is possible to have too strong an attachment to your own group. That's why we have the rule of law and anti-discrimination rules and so on and so forth. But it's in that kind of fuzzy area of what is legitimate. Is the idea of white flight, feeling discomfort at living in an area which becomes dominated by a group other than your own, and you move out, or you move your children out of a school, is that racist behaviour? Or is that a legitimate sense that your way of life has been changed too rapidly? I mean, this is where the argument now is, I think.
In your book, David, you talk about the anywheres and the somewheres. Do you think it's fair to say that the term far-right has actually become quite dated and isn't really as applicable these days?
I think, as Douglas was saying, I think the far-right still has some uses. I mean, there are some groups that would be legitimately described as far-right. Would probably
Combat 18 or something
like
that.
Or Jobbik, as you were saying, Jobbik and Golden Dawn, who are overtly racist, who are street organisations in some ways, and who are not Democrats and who use violence, who think it's legitimate to use violence as a political end. That doesn't apply to, what's the main populist party in Denmark, or
the Danish People's Party.
The Danish People's Party, the Sweden Democrats, UKIP, the Front National. I mean, there are variations, obviously, even within that, and they come from. I mean, most of the populist parties either tend to have kind of extreme right roots, like the Front National, or the kind of nutty professor roots. I mean, like UKIP or Alternative für Deutschland. These are a bunch of professors who took some rather technical issue, constitutional or currency issue, and then support poured in from elsewhere, as it were. You have very different routes for these parties. So I don't think we want to chuck out the term far right completely. We just need to use it with some discrimination. And if parties change pretty fundamentally, then we should acknowledge that change and not stick to it. But as we were saying, there's a political purpose behind wanting to use the label as widely as possible, and we see precisely the limits and the danger in doing that in Sweden, where the political class, more than anywhere else probably in Europe, Douglas knows more about this than I do, but more than anywhere else in Europe, they have tried to cordon off the main populist party, the Sweden Democrats, which does indeed have pretty horrible far-right roots, but has moved a very long way, but it continues to be outcast. So even with the latest outrage, whenever it was, 2 or 3 weeks ago in Sweden, all the other political parties were invited in to discuss it, and the Sweden Democrats were left out in the cold again. The Sweden Democrats are now leading in the public opinion polls in that country, and it has allowed, I think, the Swedish political class not to address the issues that is disturbing so many voters who are now looking to the Sweden Democrats for an answer. And that is very sad, that we have to have a party of, if not the far right, the populist right has to be the only representative of Swedish people on these mainstream issues.
One other thing which comes from this is, if you keep on saying that everyone is far right, I think I mentioned at the very beginning, it means that particularly younger people are likely to be sceptical of the idea that anyone who is called that is. So, I mean, as I say, you risk the possibility in a country like Sweden, where people say, of course X, who I know who votes Sweden Democrat, or Y, who I know who'd like to stand for the party, isn't a fascist. And then when you call another person you don't know a fascist, they say, particularly young people, I think, are suspicious of it, like the throwing around of the term racism or anti-Semitism in bad. And there's one answer to this, by the way. I mentioned this in my book, that there's an answer to this that's very obvious in the short term, which is that there should be a similar societal punishment, as it were, for using these terms knowingly erroneously, as there is for the crime itself. In other words, that if you go around calling people racist who are clearly not racist, you should be deemed to be as sort of ugly and dishonest in your politics as somebody who is a racist. If you go around saying that person is far right simply because it's convenient for you politically, instead of getting away scot-free from it and saying, well, it doesn't matter, and sort of brushing the facts away if they ever land, that person should themselves be seen to be equally destructive of the democratic process.
In your definition, Douglas, you mentioned people being opposed to democracy as being fascist, but you could say that being anti-populist is being anti-democracy. Is that the same problem?
Well, I don't like the term populist. I don't use it. I think it's become a word that, again, is close to meaning very little. There are people who define it, and as long as you know what terms you're speaking, what it is you define it as, then that's okay. But I think populist has simply become, for some people, anything that's popular. There are obviously certain traits of populism you can track. But for instance, I mean, if Hillary Clinton had nixed the election and got it absolutely right in America and got in, nobody would have said it was a populist revolt. And plenty of things she did could satisfy many definitions of populist. And the same thing with Remain. I mean, if Remain had won in the referendum, very few people would have said this is a populist backlash.
Well, I agree. It is imprecise, but it is not excluding you from the political debate.
No.
You are described as populist, so it is very elastic and very baggy, but it is far preferable to far right.
Yes, far right says that is it.
That says that you're beyond the pale. And as I say, I mean, most mainstream politics is actually populist. Populists tend to be the people that take certain aspects of the mainstream, like fellow citizen favouritism, like suspicion of elites, further than the mainstream. It's almost more of a kind of attitude or a style than a set of policies.
That was Douglas Murray and David Goodhart.